Live stream audio check, 1, 2. Audio check, 1, 2. Live stream audio check, 1, 2.
Good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock, so I shall now resume this inquiry. My name is Luke Fleming. I'm the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to conduct this inquiry. So this is day 4 of the inquiry. We estimate it to be a 6-day inquiry. The appeal is made by Beechcroft Land Limited under the provisions of Section 78 of the Town and Country Planning Act, and it's against the failure of North Somerset Council to give notice within the prescribed period of a decision on an application for planning permission. The proposal is described as outline application for the erection of up to 62 dwellings, 30% affordable housing alongside a new access, landscaping and other associated works, with all matters reserved for future approval apart from access. And it's at land to the east of Church Lane and the north of Front Street, Churchill. So just to reiterate, it's an outline application with approval being sought for detailed matters relating to access only. So firstly, usual reminders, electronic devices, please set them to silent if you will. Attendance sheet should be circulating, please sign it. And if council can return that to me at the end of the day, that would be helpful. Fire alarm, not expecting any today. If there is a fire alarm, fire exit to my left there, alternatively out the main doors and assemble in the car park to the right of the building. Okay. So I'll aim for breaks at, through the morning, mid-afternoon, but also aim for an hour break at lunchtime as well. So we've already heard a lot of evidence. There should be an inquiry programme somewhere at the back of the room that you should all have seen. I'm told that's now online as well, so anybody following it can see where we are with the inquiry. It is going to plan so far. I might regret saying that, but that's it is so far. Slight variation on the programme, but the issues are the same. Today we're going to hear evidence related from both parties on the housing land supply. First of all, we're going to do that in the usual sort of inquiry way, which will be examination in chief and cross-examination, but then that will be followed more likely than not this afternoon with a roundtable discussion that will solely focus on the supply, but specifically the sites which are disputed between the main parties. So the roundtable discussion, that'll be something that I will lead, seeking views from one side and then the other. So obviously the lawyers are able to be involved and more than welcome, and obviously we'd expect them to do so. It's a public inquiry, but it will be a more free-flowing structure than what you've seen so far, really. Okay. So is there anybody here today that wishes to speak to the inquiry that has not? Okay. So if I can take the gentleman to this side first.
Yes, I would like to speak.
Yeah, can you give me your name, please, and your interest?
Yeah, it's Nathan Connolly, and I'm a local resident.
Nathan Connolly, local resident. And are you opposing the scheme?
Yes, I'm opposing the scheme.
Yep. Okay. So if you do speak, just bear in mind that, well, you've said you're going to, bear in mind that your name will be recorded in my decision. I think you're obviously aware it's being live streamed as well, so you should be aware of that. I may give you the opportunity to ask questions of the appellant's case, but as you say, as I said, today we're dealing with housing land supply only, so can't expect those witnesses to answer any questions on anything other than that, really. So What I'd probably do is I'll hear from you sort of this morning once I've done these opening announcements, and if I'd asked you to come and sit at the table, you could do that now while I'm talking if you like, if that's okay. Just to check, is that okay if I hear from the interested parties first? Yep. Mr. Garvey, happy with that? Yep. So you may as well get set. Have you got any questions? No. All right. And the second gentleman, please.
Hello, yes, Oliver Turberville. I'd like to speak as well. I am a resident opposing the scheme.
Thank you.
So sorry, was that Oliver Turner?
Turberville. It's written down in the piece of paper I'll give you in a second.
Thank you.
It's the same instructions, really, I'd been given to your colleague. You happy with all that?
Fully understood and happy to take questions as well.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't catch that last bit.
I'm happy to take questions as well, so fully understood everything you said.
Okay. All right, so once we've heard from Mr. Connolly, just literally come and get yourself settled and we'll hear from you. Should be a microphone on the table. Okay, but just wait, just one before we get on to that. Okay. Dr. Jaycock, you wanted to say something to me at the start.
Thank you, sir. In response to my observations on the 7th of June, I've received responses from the appellants regarding all three of the matters that I raised then. I've made a brief response to each one of those, combined into a single document. Can I deliver that to the inquiry? I have delivered it to PINS, so there is a digital version coming your way.
Okay. May well be easy if are you happy for Dr. Jaycock to read that out to us?
So I wonder if we can review it in the first instance. Obviously, we can't just have a constant back and forth between ourselves. We understood those issues are dealt with and not going to be too difficult. So if we can read it, and if it's something we think we can go in without causing upset to the programme.
Can you give a copy to Mr. Garvey in the first instance? If you've got one for the council, that would help as well.
Indeed, sir.
And then I'll come back to Mr. Garvey after we've heard from the two gentlemen this morning. Just put mine there, and if we accept it, I'll have a look at it. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So before you're obviously drawn straight to that, is there anything else that you wish to draw to my attention before we get on?
No, thank you, sir.
No. Okay. So Mr. Connolly, microphone on. Yeah. Obviously speak clearly. If you've got water, yes. Relax. Take your time. I would say that there's no need for you to repeat anything that I've already heard. I don't know if you're following it, but obviously welcome whatever you said, and the same will go for when you follow on. If I've heard it, I'm not going to attach sort of more weight to it. Just because I've heard it twice. The other thing is the opposition may well have questions on what you say, and you're happy to answer questions if they have any. So the same for you. Yep, nodding. Okay. So without further delay, when you're ready, we'd like to hear from you, Mr. Connolly.
Perfect. Well, firstly, thank you for allowing me to speak today. I am deeply concerned by the proposed development and the increased probability it brings of a serious accident at both Church Lane and Front Street. The design states that it is building a safe development that encourages new residents to walk and cycle into Churchill. The Highways Authority's response to the outline planning was that additional development with further vehicles and pedestrians in this area would have an unacceptable impact on highway safety. Footpaths and transport links are already wholly inadequate in the area, considering the number of pupils at the school adjacent to the site, and the area is already dangerous with pedestrians sharing the road along Front Street. Point 2.7 of the transport assessment, headed collision data, states the applicant has reviewed the previous 21 years of highway safety records and raised no safety concerns for pedestrians using Front Street. Whilst there is yet to be a fatality, many accidents go unreported, both to the school on Stat 19 forms and therefore do not make it to crash map. The school has been concerned about road safety and congestion in the area for years without the proposed development to add to it. They regularly contact parents to discuss the severe congestion, lack of adherence to road rules, accidents, and many near misses. The head teacher of the school summed up in a newsletter to parents from September 2021, "We are fortunate that our academy is located in a beautiful rural setting. The price we pay for this is the narrow lanes and road which provide access to our site. Nothing is more important than the safety of our students, and the past week has seen several near misses caused by inconsiderate driving, turning, or parking." In February of this year, the head teacher again raised the road safety issue, referencing a child being hit by a car in the village, and then recently there have been 2 further incidents. The number of children at peak times sharing the road on the walk along Front Street still surprises me now after living there for 6 years, and I'm shocked that worse is yet to happen. It's not just at peak times. Children can leave and walk to the local post office in sixth form and carry along Front Street and also down Church Lane throughout the day. The developer's transport assessment in Appendix 8 shows that an estimated 65% of all cars will exit the proposed development onto Front Street and turn left through the village. The site also has footpaths that exit onto Front Street at a natural narrowing point in the road due to on-road parking, a point that already has issues in the village. Irrespective of how many cars or deliveries they propose will use or access the site, they are still increasing both traffic volumes and pedestrian volumes on Front Street. So an area where children are already in accidents with increased traffic and increased pedestrians sharing the same road does not make any sense to me. While I appreciate you will have a plan for the site visit and you visited for the traffic assessment, I'd implore you to walk along the site, along Front Street, in the direction of the local shop with the children and vehicles for you to see for yourself. In the opposite direction from the site, crossing Church Lane, in their road safety audit stage 1, TMS, on behalf of PEP, has highlighted visibility splay concerns for Church Lane. It states, problem location, proposed pedestrian crossing Church Lane. Summary, risk of injury to pedestrians. During the site visit, it was noted that there is excessive parking within the vicinity of the proposed pedestrian crossing. This is partly due to the worn school keep clear line markings. This may result in the visibility splay and intervisibility being reduced, potentially resulting in pedestrians walking out into oncoming vehicles. It is not due to the school's clear signs, but a lack of any other parking nearby, and crossing Church Lane is already extremely hazardous due to the parked cars. The recommendation, the visibility splay should be kept clear at all times. This could be done by refreshing the school keep clear markings. The feasibility of introducing double yellow lines in the vicinity of the pedestrian crossing on the eastern side could also be investigated. The fact is, no one pays any notice to them and have not done for the 6 years that we have been living there. I can see the accident that TMS have envisaged occurring, which would make 2 major pedestrian collision points worse simply because of the development. Beyond accident or injury, traffic and congestion is already a significant issue living in the area. This is already an incredibly congested road network, exacerbated by on-street parking and tight roads. Within 1 kilometre in every direction from the proposed site, either the road narrows or on-street parking means that traffic is single file. Ambulance crews could not get to my wife in time for our son's birth, having got stuck on Church Lane and needing to find an alternative route to us. This was outside of peak hours at 11 p.m. at night. Nearly all congestion issues, however, are linked to the school, and parents I've talked to who have seen the plans say the proposed development would be great, as it will become the easiest place to drop off and pick up. Congestion at the junction of Hilliers Lane and Front Street is appalling. Many parents slow their cars at the junction to let children out, mount the pavement, or let the children out into the road. The congestion that would build up from parents driving through the proposed development to drop off or park and wait to collect would be significant, and congestion to both Church Lane and Front Street would be affected even further. The proposals state that the developer will introduce traffic calming measures, but this does not mitigate human nature, and given its proximity to the school, is even more likely to lead to it being a preferred location for parents to drop or collect children. The volume of agricultural vehicles on the road in the area, given the proximity to working farms and Thatcher's Orchard, would mean that irrespective of traffic calming measures, the proposed development will still become a rat run for the heavily used golf course and the widely advertised Yatton train station that runs direct to London. Reading the road safety report from TMS confirmed what I see on a regular basis, and I passionately believe the risks caused by the proposed development do not make up for the very real need for more housing in the area. It is simply that other sites are better prepared to accommodate the congestion and have a lower risk. The Highways Agency sum up best in the authority's response: further vehicles and pedestrians in this area would have unacceptable impact on highway safety. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, just wait a sec. I haven't got any questions, but Mr. Garvey, have you got any questions?
No, sir, thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much for that. All right. Take your time and whenever you're ready. Whenever you're ready.
Sure. Sir, to provide a bit of context, my wife and I moved into Churchill in February of last year. We live on Hilliers Lane, directly opposite the appeal site. There are a plethora of reasons I object to the proposed site, most of which have already been raised. However, I would like to talk primarily about local employment, or rather lack of it. Paragraph 2.3, entitled Local Facilities Access and Movement of the Design and Access Statement provided by Inspire Design, states the following. Churchill is also host for local employment providers like the University of Bristol Veterinary School, Monaghan Mushrooms Langford, Thatcher's Cider, and a number of long-established businesses like sign manufacturers and a fireworks supplier. The Churchill Parish Council response to the planning application document, of which you'll be aware, responds and refutes this with a fact check of this statement. I'd just like to add my findings as of this week. The University of Bristol Veterinary School are currently advertising 12 vacancies, one of which is a fixed-term maternity cover and one is an internship. The rest require a specialised veterinarian qualification and the maximum advertised salary is £27,300. Monaghan Mushrooms are advertising for 3 roles: mushroom harvesters, packhouse general operatives, and farm/stroke general operatives, all very low-paid jobs. Thatcher's Cider in Sandford and the Associated Railway Inn are advertising for 11 roles, of which 4 are engineer/technician related, and the rest are unskilled roles or apprenticeships. These are mainly aimed at school leavers. Touts, a petrol station supermarket, are advertising for 5 unskilled minimum wage roles. Starburst, the local fireworks supplier, and Create, the sign maker mentioned in the document, are companies with extremely low FTE and are not hiring. The Mendip Activity Centre, another local employer, are advertising numerous temporary internship or apprentice roles alongside 2 full-time instructor roles, all of which are low paid. The Crown, the Nelson, the Stag and Hounds, and the Churchill Arms, all pubs in the village, occasionally advertise for temporary bar staff. Currently, only the Nelson, a pub which is only open part week, is recruiting. I think it's fair to point out, by far, the vast majority of local employment opportunities are low-paid, internship, apprenticeship, or seasonal roles, which would typically be taken by school leavers or sixth form leavers looking to earn money in advance of a gap year or saving for university. There are a handful of skilled roles, and with a recent application for 25 houses permitted at Dinghurst in Churchill, alongside the other houses currently being built in the village, of which you are undoubtedly aware, there is already an existing pool of applicants to fill this small number of roles. This situation is made even worse by recent Sandford development and also a further 49 houses, a recently approved Averson Young application on land to the north of Greenhill Road in Sandford, which will be built before any more will ever do in Churchill. Aside from what I've mentioned above, there really is no employment opportunity available to support substantial mortgage payments unless travelling further afield to Bristol or Weston-super-Mare. The effect of 62 houses, the lack of appropriate public transport, including inter-village public transport, together with the associated number of motor vehicle commuters into Bristol, Weston-super-Mare or Yatton for the train into London, cannot be underestimated, especially given the current situation of traffic density at peak times at both proposed entrances to the appeal site, which you will have no doubt witnessed for yourself during last week's site visit. Thank you.
Thank you. I've not got any questions on what you've said. Mr. Garvey? Okay. Thank you very much. So just the matters raised by Dr. Jacob this morning then, have you had a chance to consider the document?
I have, sir. We're going to invite you, sir, to exclude this document going in. It's a 6-page report that deals with highways, flood risk and ecology. In order to respond to this, I'd need to refer this note to my experts on those 3 disciplines, including Mr. Farmer, who you heard from. I don't know whether I can get that done this week, truthfully, because we'd have to refer to them and see what their capacity's like. But it would prevent us, potentially mean that I couldn't close on Wednesday, or I'd have to do something after the inquiry. So, sir, I say Dr. Jacob had the opportunity to put in representations. He did that before the inquiry, late. We responded. He's had the opportunity to question my witnesses, including Mr. Farmer, and we can't just have it so that it's a constant drip of further evidence and points coming in. So I say, sir, in the first instance, it should be excluded. If you disagree with me, I'll make representations on that.
Okay. So, Dr. Jacob, I didn't accept the document, and I think it's fair that this is a public inquiry, and there has been sort of deadlines that needed to be met for a long time in the lead up to the inquiry, and you can't simply have a process of keep having a back and forth on evidence. So I think on the basis of the issues that are raised, and the fact that we've already heard that evidence at the inquiry, I'm going to decline to accept it.
I understand, sir. Thank you.
Okay, but thank you, though. Okay. So, is there anything else that anyone wishes to mention to me this morning before we...
No, nothing from us, sir.
Okay.
No, thank you.
Okay. So, Ms. Richards, are you?
Yes, it is. We'll just need a couple of minutes to sort herself out, so I don't know whether you want to rise or whether we'll just wait for her to take a seat.
I think we'll just wait, if that's okay. But do take your time. Don't feel rushed. Make sure you're set with everything that you need.
Are you ready, Mrs. Richards?
I am, thank you.
Right, good. Thank you very much. So, could you turn up your proof of evidence, please?
Well, can you just
No, I will
introduce
start.
her
I
in
was going to
usual-
introduce her in the usual.
Thought you were going to leap
No,
straight
I'm
in.
not diving straight in, sir. I just want to turn to the second page of her evidence because I'm going to want to take her to it in just a moment.
Apologies.
So, you are Natalie Richards, is that correct?
I am.
And you're the Council's Principal Planning Policy Technical Officer within the Planning Policy team.
Yes, that's right.
And you tell us on page 2 of your evidence you've 18 years' experience in local government, development management, and 16 of them in planning, policy research, and monitoring and evidence. Now, would I be right in thinking that you are the person within the council whose job it is to compile the 5-year housing land supply statement each year, and you're the one who, knows each site, monitors each site, and essentially are the go-to person if you want to know something about a housing site in Weston-super-Mare, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And the reason I say that is if I look at the 4th paragraph of your statement of qualifications and experience, you there set out all of the things you do. The one particular point I wanted to take you to was where you say, I attend various stakeholder groups. Now then, what sort of stakeholder groups do you attend? I imagine all sorts, but just give the inspector a flavour of what it is you're doing when you go to those things and how it helps you in your work.
Yes, so a good example of that would be something like the Locking Parklands Stakeholder Forum. That's one of our strategic sites that's building out, well, it will be a total of 3,950 houses. So that board is represented, there's developers from the various landowners there, the infrastructure providers, the local school, community representatives, and myself in a housing delivery overview capacity, and other officers from across the council. Similar groups exist for various developments, and then there's also internal groups which focus on how we can move sites through the system before they get that far, but that's quite a good example of when delivery is happening on the ground, how we oversee that and support it.
Yeah, and the sorts of exchanges you have with developers and their agents, how helpful do you find them in establishing whether a site's likely to come forward and the rate of delivery?
It's most helpful. It informs much of what I do. So having those conversations on a regular and ongoing basis, as I say, also represented by people like infrastructure providers, it's looking at the developments in the round.
Yeah, good. All right. Now, out of interest, do you happen to know whether anybody from Beechcroft, either a member of the company or any of their agents, attend any of these stakeholder meetings?
Not that I'm aware of, no. None that I sit on.
All right. Well, fine. Now, I won't read the rest of that paragraph out. I won't ask you to do so either. And I think Mr. Stevenson needs to put his phone in a bucket of water. Right, well, your iPad in a bucket of water, then if it goes off again, I shall do it myself. Good. Next, you say in your evidence the facts stated are true to the best of your knowledge and belief and represent your professional opinion. Does that remain your view?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, the inspector's read your evidence. We don't need to trawl through it, I don't think, but I would like to examine one or two points in just a little detail. So if I could trouble you, please, to turn to page 22.
Yes.
On page 22, we see set out there a 5-year housing land supply calculation. You have a deliverable supply of some 7,599 dwellings, an annual requirement of 1,462 homes, and you calculate a 5.2 years supply.
Yes.
Was that the position that you anticipated the council would be able to demonstrate when you wrote this proof of evidence?
Yes, it is.
What happened after you wrote the evidence?
We received the Moor Road appeal decision from Inspector Wildsmith, who concluded that we could not demonstrate 5-year land supply, which is an agreed position now with the appellant. His decision referred to 3 particular sites,
Yes.
and if you take away the supply from those sites that he was specifically concerned about, it would have the effect of removing 400 dwellings from my position that you've just read out. So that, for the avoidance of doubt, would be 7,199 units. If divided by the 1,462 annual requirement, that would equate now to 4.9 years supply.
Yeah. Now, just for clarity's sake, if we go to the core strategy policy CS13 and ask ourselves the question, what is the annual requirement reflected by that policy? It's not 1,462, is it?
No, it isn't. The core strategy adopted requirement was 20,985 homes over a 20-year period, which equates to 1,049.25 each year. That requirement has passed its 5-year sell-by date, if you like. So that 1,462 that you see on page 22 of my proof is that calculated by the standard methodology to derive a local housing need figure, and it also incorporates a 5% buffer.
Yeah, good. So what we know is the 4.9 year supply that you believe you can demonstrate is calculated by reference to the increased requirement delivered by the standard method.
Yes, that's correct.
All right. Well, we'll just leave the question of how much land the council's able to supply for cross-examination, I think, because I know my learned friend's got some questions. I think if I ask you any more, we'll just be treading the ground that he's going to tread anyway. We'll move on. And instead, let's look at page 23, because on page 23, you have a section headed Other Considerations Relevant to Housing Delivery.
Yes.
If I can put it this way, the sort of things you focus on are, in a sense, crystal ball gazing. We know where we are. That's your page 22.
Yeah.
The section that begins on page 23 looks to the future and asks the question, well, how are we likely to be doing as the years unwind? Is that fair?
Yes.
Good. So, starting with the section on the housing delivery test, you tell us in the paragraphs that begin at paragraph 89 and then run through to, paragraph 103, I think, that the housing delivery within North Somerset has steadily increased. Look at page 25, you've got a table there. And what you've done is you've said, well, all right, the housing delivery test has been operating for 4 years. I'm going to work out what it would have shown the council was delivering had it applied from the start of the plan period. Is that correct?
Yes, so that table goes back to 2010, the
Yes.
11 year, and as you say, what I've done is replicated, if that test had existed at that time, 3 years worth of the requirements each year against the preceding 3 years delivery as a measure of our performance and how that's increased to date.
Now, it's often said when people come to Weston-super-Mare to tell us about our housing land supply that things are hopeless, that we're never going to sort out our 5-year supply. I paraphrase, but I don't think those remarks will strike you as particularly unusual. People come along and say very rude things about our 5-year supply. They do indeed. Tell me, how do you view the future, looking at the table we see on page 25? What is the picture in North Somerset?
Things are improving. We're making steady and continuous improvements. So page 25, the very top row of table 8, the delivery over the preceding 3-year period each time is steadily increasing. A number of our sites in the adopted development plan are difficult. They're within Weston-super-Mare, have low land values and have had issues such as land contamination. The council are working hard to boost supply and bring forward those land holdings within our direct control and support those which aren't. Again, the adopted development plan identified the strategic site of Weston-super-Mare, which I'm sure, Western Villages, which I'm sure we'll talk about in detail later. 30% of our housing was to be delivered on that site. It's complicated. A strategic site such as that takes time. A lot of eggs in the core strategy were in one basket. We're looking now forward to the next period, as we do, preparing a new draft plan. The preferred options for the local plan 2038 is seeking to try and find a mixed portfolio of sites that can be brought forward to support supply in the short term, whilst again also planning for longer term delivery.
Yeah, well, let's just unpack this a bit. So, when was the core strategy adopted?
This is a very long answer to what seems like a simple question.
But there's a reason for asking it, which is I want to try and understand why delivery might not have been outstanding early on in the plan period. So just give the inspector a flavour of the problems you had to contend with early on in the plan period so that we can work out whether the situation is perhaps as dire as Mr. Tiley would have us think. So, you adopted the plan when?
The core strategy was initially adopted in 2012.
And then what?
It was subject to a High Court challenge on the basis of the housing requirement.
Yeah. And in a nutshell, Bristol University challenged, didn't they, the council's housing land requirements?
They challenged the inspector's decision in that it was found to give inadequate and unintelligible reasons.
Yes. So that requirement not properly explained, not properly reasoned. Plan, was it quashed?
It wasn't quashed. It was remitted back to the planning inspectorate for re-examination. That re-examination then took place in 2 parts. So along with policy CS13, which identified the housing requirement that we spoke about earlier, a number of other policies which may have required consequential change were also remitted. So those being the settlement hierarchy policies, essentially.
So policies such as CS14, which distributes the housing between different settlements.
Yes, and the area policies that flow from that, such as CS32, 33.
Quite so. So do you know, when was it finally that the council was able to re-adopt its core strategy with an approved, I'm going to put it like that, an approved housing land requirement?
Yep, so that happened in 2 parts. In 2015, the housing requirement was found to be sound, and its adoption was actually directed by the Secretary of State.
Yes,
and
that's my odd choice of words.
And then in 2017, following a further round of re-examination, some changes were made to the area policies that we spoke about, and they were finally re-adopted.
Now, what sort of effect did the hiatus between, on the one hand, adopting the plan, initially back in 2012, then certain policies being quashed and remitted back, and then re-adoption, what effect did that hiatus have on the council's ability to bring forward housing land in North Somerset?
Sites to deliver that housing requirement essentially had to be identified retrospectively, and the policies to achieve that higher housing requirement had to catch up.
Yeah, and whilst the council was busy trying to sort things out, what were developers doing? Were they focusing on sites that had been allocated? Well, were they focusing on the strategic sites, places like Western Villages, or were they doing other things?
No, Western Villages was very slow to take place. There was lots of planning by appeal and speculative applications that were flying
So you had
around.
planning by appeal rather than focus on the strategic sites, such as Western Villages. When was the focus on Western Villages finally achieved, do you think?
Not until very recently, and unfortunately shortly before COVID, in fact.
Yeah. So, right, well then, what's the picture if one goes to Western Villages today? What does one see on the ground?
Hundreds of houses coming out of the ground, 677, I believe it was. Last time there was an official count of those under construction. As I say, houses are coming out of the ground. There is a significant amount of infrastructure delivery that has now gone in within the last 3 years. There's spine roads, there's primary schools open, there's shops, pharmacies, retail facilities.
Yeah. So your view is, if one were to cast our eyes back, if that were possible, to 3 years ago, stand on these sites 3 years ago, what would you have seen?
You would have seen housing being delivered, but at a much slower rate, and as I say, not supported by that infrastructure. And at that time, again, we'll run through the sites in detail this afternoon. Western Villages is essentially 2 separate parts. On one site, Persimmon are wholly in control and delivering that. On the other site, the Locking Parklands side, it was only St Modwen and Homes England delivering 3 years ago. There's now also outlets from Taylor Wimpey, Bellway, planning applications in from other providers such as Curo.
Can I interject? I'm not really objecting, but I understood that the purpose of these exchanges were not to get into specific sites.
We're not.
And I'm more saying, for the purpose of your note, sir, I've no problem with this evidence going in because it will come out at some time today. I just wonder whether it's going to be more helpful to you, sir, that we hear this in the roundtable session so that the note that the inspector has is codified.
I understand the point. I think there's some context to the question. I think just proceed, bear that in mind. I don't want to go over everything twice.
What I'm wanting to do is not descend into individual site detail. That's not appropriate. What I am seeking to do is to provide a context within which one asks the question, is there any point at all, first of all, in us trying to nail down a precise housing land supply figure? And if one reads Hallam Land Management, the question is best answered by asking the question, well, if one's going to have a precise number, let's think about, shall we, of the things that indicate whether things are likely to get better or worse. I can take us the relevant paragraphs in due course when we talk to Mr. Tiley. But what you need to do in order to apply Hallam Land Management is ask these contextual questions, or whilst they might come out in the round table, they might not. And that's why I'm putting these questions to Mrs. Richards. Because I don't control the round table, you do, sir.
Yep.
Right, good. Thank you, Mrs. Richards.
Now well, I would also say, as we talked about, just to be clear, the round table that I will be leading will be focused solely on those disputed sites. I won't be asking any questions about context. I'd expect you to deal with that in your evidence.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. I'm not going to take a long time over this. I gave you time estimate and I will stick to it. Good. So, having looked at the extent to which difficulties in adopting the core strategy might have impacted upon early delivery of housing and developers' response to the difficulties that the council experienced, we've looked at the improvement of the housing delivery test. What I would like to just briefly touch upon then is if we could take up the MPPF. Do you have that to hand, Mrs. Richards?
Yes, I do.
If you could turn, please, to page 21 of the framework. where you will find the second part of paragraph 74. And before we read that paragraph, or that part of the paragraph, can I just ask you, what is the council, what is the buffer the council must now apply as a result of its performance in the housing delivery test?
As of this year, it is a 5% buffer.
Yes. Now, knowing that it's a 5% authority, if I can use that word, those words, looking at page 21, the second part of paragraph 24 of the framework tells us that there can be, if you like, 3 different levels of buffer. You've got a 5%, a 10%, a 20%, and it tells us when each of those different buffers might be applied.
Yes.
What is the significance, please, of North Somerset now being a 5% authority rather than, as it was, a 20% authority? What does that tell us about our performance?
The 20% buffer must apply where there has been significant under-delivery of housing to improve the prospect of planned supply. By virtue of the fact that we're now a 5% authority, that means that we do not have a record of significant under-delivery of housing within the past 3 years.
Yes, which does not suggest that we haven't been under-delivering, that's obvious.
No, that's agreed.
We're not doing 100% of delivery, so we obviously are under-delivering to that extent.
Correct.
But
it's not a significant under-delivery.
Quite so. So if one's trying to calibrate the authority's performance, your qualification of the allegation that we are an under-delivering authority is that?
Yes, that we're not significantly under-delivering.
Yeah, okay, we need to improve, but the shortfall is not significant. Fine. Rather, the shortfall annual delivery is not significant. So, with that in mind, it might be said later, I want to stick to categories rather than going down to individual sites.
Yes.
One of our bugbears in North Somerset is that we have this habit of sticking with allocated sites that aren't coming forwards. Now, you tell us in your proof that the council is preparing a new local plan.
Yes.
Just out of interest, when do you expect the new plan to be adopted?
Not until, I think it's the end of 2023 at the earliest.
End of 2023 at the earliest. All right. Now, as a part of that exercise, are you reviewing the question of which allocated sites, that is, sites allocated in the current development plan, ought to be taken forward into the next plan?
Yes, that's part of the strategic housing land assessment process, which myself and colleagues in the planning policy team are undertaking.
Yeah. So tell me your approach, please. How are you approaching the question of which sites should be rolled forward?
So the sites to be rolled forward, many of them feature within the preferred options consultation draft, which went out, as I say, for consultation from March and April this year to seek views on them. However, within my evidence, I only rely upon a relatively small proportion of the current allocations, around 30% of them, in fact, within the 5-year supply. For anywhere there is no clear evidence of deliverability in the short term, as I say, they'll be reviewed to see whether they remain suitable in principle to carry forwards of allocations, but they're not relied upon within the 5-year supply calculations.
So you've knocked out about 2/3 for the purposes of this inquiry?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, good. Just give me a moment. Fine, well then, final question for you in chief is this. How do you see the council's 5-year housing land performance improving over the next 12 to 18 months? I'm putting it another way. Do you think the performance of the council will improve over the next 12 to 18 months? If so, to what extent and why?
I do think that both the housing completions and the 5-year supply position are improving and will continue to do so. Part of that is that new local plan, identifying additional sites, greenfield, edge of villages, bringing those forward as allocations in a plan-led way. Our policies, such as CS32 for service villages, do permit greenfield sites outside of settlement boundaries, subject to certain scale and criteria, to come forward through the plan-making process, and that is happening. Mr. Etchells mentioned in evidence the other day a site at Churchill itself, Dinghurst Road, which came forward under those provisions and was granted consent last month. The Western Villages continues to pick up, as I mentioned, I'll keep it general, multiple volume house builders are now delivering on that site.
Yeah. Are there any particular challenges or breaks on delivery that you see operating in this district over the next 12 to 18 months that are going to present particular challenges?
No.
Thank you very much. Well, sir, those are the only questions I have in chief.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Richards. I think we'll take a short break before cross-examination. So we'll come back at 11:05. Inquiry is adjourned. 11, the inquiry is resumed. Mr. Garvey, you may now cross-examine Ms. Richards.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm right in thinking it's Miss Richards, not
It's Mrs.
Mrs. Richards, sorry. I'm going to start by asking you a few questions about the points you've made in your evidence in chief this morning, and then we'll go on to a number of other points. Just to warn you, there's going to be a lot of documents I'm going to ask you to go through, so...
That's fine. I'm using the laptop for the core document, so it's all
well,
here to hand.
Don't let me rush you. It takes however long it takes, but just there's a lot of them, so...
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you the first point that you said in evidence in chief. You said that you had written your proof on the basis that the council supply was 5.2 years.
Yes.
But you said subsequent to the proof going out, we received an appeal decision.
The timing of that is slightly out, I believe, isn't it? The Inspector Wildsmith's decision was the week before, I think, the 27th of April.
Yeah, that's because paragraph 3 of your proof of evidence, if you wouldn't mind turning it up.
Yeah. Yes, I have that.
Yeah, because there you refer to the yet an appeal decision, and you refer to the fact that there had been the conclusion that the council cannot demonstrate a deliverable 5 years housing land supply. So the council did have it when you produced your figure. And
We did. It was published before this proof of evidence was submitted to the inquiry, yes.
right, but subsequent to you passing through the proof of evidence, the council decided to accept those conclusions.
Yes.
In the right, thank you. The next point I wanted to ask you about is the Western Villages. And we're not going to talk about sites in any detail. I just want to talk about what you've said in evidence in chief.
Yep.
As I understood your answers, and forgive me if I've got it wrong, you were saying that owing to the complications with the adoption of the plan, with the legal challenges and whatnot, that has held back delivery on the Western Villages sites?
It did in part. It slowed down things such as Section 106 agreements being completed, and whilst the focus with the planning policy team remained upon getting the plan readopted, work slowed on other areas where we could have supported housing delivery at Western Villages.
Right. Can you turn up Mr. Tiley's proof of evidence? Yeah. We're going to get to page 74, if you would, please.
Yes, I have that.
Thank you. So his figure 13.3, he provides the completions on the Western Villages strategic sites.
Yes.
I'm going to assume you don't disagree, so I'll give you, sir, a moment. It's page 74,
Yeah,
sir.
yeah.
Thank you. I presume you don't disagree with the contents of this table insofar as it demonstrates completions?
No, the completions data is factually correct, yes.
Yes, so we can note, therefore, that the Western Villages strategic sites, they were delivering, not just granted, but delivering prior to the adoption of the core strategy in 2012.
They were discrete parcels upon the Locking Parklands side of the development. There were 2 full planning applications that came forward in isolation in advance of the larger outlines. So one was for 100 and one was for 150. And those 2 phases, as I say, they were full consents early on and they came forward in isolation.
Yes, and then, because I understood you were saying, well, it wasn't until just prior to the pandemic did these sites start to get going, but you can see actually, in terms of completions, we're seeing completions over 200 in 2014, 2015.
Yep.
2016, 2017 is actually the best year.
Yes. Yep, that one, there were 242 completions on the Persimmon side in that year.
I want to understand this point that you said, well, developers were holding back owing to complications with the legal challenge to the plan. Help me with this. I'm a developer. I've got my planning permission. Why on earth do I care about what's going on with the legal challenges to a plan in the context that I've got my permission?
As we've looked at in this figure, they were building. They weren't coming forward with the next phases of their planning permissions.
Yeah. You said that the reason why, as I understood your evidence, the reason why these sites were slowed down or frustrated is because of legal challenges to the plan. And I'm saying, why on earth would that make any difference? Put me into the mindset. I'm the developer. I've got my permission. Why do I care one bit what's going on with legal challenges?
I think my point was intended to be, and I'm sorry if it wasn't clear, that during that time frame of the legal challenge, the delivery was slower, not directly, this developer says, oh, there's a legal challenge, I won't build my housing. That wasn't my intention. So.
Right, so the legal challenges had no bearing on the delivery of this strategic site. Is that fair?
Not to say no bearing, as I just mentioned, the council, whilst they could have been bringing forward the SPD and the master planning and supporting in that way, that wasn't happening. The council officers were still reviewing the plan, undertaking new evidence, but no, not directly the developers.
Right, because I understood it, what was the point that you were trying to draw out is, well, don't worry about these sites. The reason why they've been slow is explained through the fact that there is a lot of faff with legal challenges, but that's all been done with, and now these sites can go off. But actually, is it right that that narrative's incorrect? Because actually the legal challenges didn't frustrate the delivery of these strategic sites.
As I've said, I think they are a factor. The council's involvement with the legal challenge and re-preparing the evidence and going through that plan-led system again has slowed down the council's focus on supporting the delivery. Yeah.
Okay, final point on this, because again, I'm a developer. I've got my permission. The council are having a difficult time. You're busy with a legal challenge. Why do I care?
You probably wouldn't, and as I mentioned, at that time, there were only a small number of consents that existed to be built out. So those first two phases of 100 units and 150. Beyond that, and throughout the time of the challenge, where the council were focused perhaps on other matters, is when the major outlines started to come forward.
Okay. So would you agree with me that developers would not have held back delivery of these sites based on legal challenges?
Any that were consented at that time that they could have brought forward, no, the legal challenge would not impede them from doing that.
Thank you very much. The next point that you made in your evidence in chief is you were talking about what the new local plan will do. Have I understood it correctly where you said that the new local plan will bring forward greenfield sites on the edge of settlements to assist with delivering a 5-year supply?
Not necessarily as a discrete exercise to boost the 5-year supply. It's a new plan, and as part of that plan-led approach, some of the draft allocations, it's a matter of public record. I'm not sure if it is in the core documents, the whole document, but that plan does propose to allocate greenfield edge of settlement sites, and when looking in the round, those are likely to come forward quicker than some of the more strategic sized developments that are also proposed to be allocated. So as a consequence, they will come forward quicker. It's not public stated anywhere that that is directly to increase the 5-year supply as at today. That's part of the longer term plan making exercise.
So it's fair to say then the council are reliant on greenfield edge of settlement sites in order to try and meet and significantly boost their housing and land supply.
They will be part of a mixed portfolio of sites that come forward. If it were all to be strategic developments or indeed all to be urban intensification sites, there's a number of those in the plan as well. We mentioned earlier there are remediation issues with some of these brownfield land sites. I'm sure that will come up in the discussion later. But having all of the sites as more difficult and perhaps complex would backload supply. So a mixed portfolio for a local plan covering a 15-year horizon will inevitably include some short-term supply. Much of that is greenfield village sites. There's also greenfield sites, Weston-super-Mare, the other 3 towns. As I say, it's a mix and a range of different sizes and types of site.
Thank you. Can you turn up the National Planning Policy Framework, please?
Yep.
And we're going to paragraph 69, if you would, please.
Yes, I've got that.
And it just flows from the point you were making there a moment ago about, it says small and medium-sized sites can make an important contribution to meeting the housing requirement of an area and are often built out relatively quickly.
Yes.
And that is consistent with the point you're making, which is strategic sites with multiple outlets can take time,
They can.
whereas smaller sites or medium-sized sites, they are the ones typically one developer, and they're the ones that oftentimes can actually give a quick delivery.
Yes, typically, yes.
And when we're talking about small and medium-sized sites, we're talking about sites like the appeal proposal, 62 dwellings.
Yes, I'd count the appeal proposal as a medium-sized site, yeah.
Thank you. As regards the new local plan, I say the new local plan, the emerging
Yeah.
local plan, there's obviously difference of opinion about when that's going to come forward and whatnot, but as we sit here today, we still agree that the inspector can only afford that very limited weight.
Yes, yes, that's agreed.
Thank you. Okay, that's all the questions arising out of evidence in chief. I'd like you, if you would, turn up the core strategy. So we're going to go to core document A1. And when you're in core document A1, we're going to go to page 65.
Yes, I have that.
Thank you. So this is core strategy CS 13. The policy sets out the minimum figure of 20,985 dwellings for the period 2006 to 2026.
Yep.
The policy also says that the appropriate level of new homes will be reviewed by 2018.
Yes, it does.
I just want to go through a little bit of the background as to the review and what...
May I just raise one minor point for my own friend goes down this line? So at other inquiries I have attended recently on behalf of North Somerset, people have taken this tack, and their tack has been to say things along the lines of, well, the requirements out of date, the policy's out of date, and so on and so forth. Now, I read the appellant's statement of case very carefully, and one of the striking things about the statement of case is there's no allegation at all that any of the policies in this plan are out of date. And so I'm just going to put down a marker that if that's to be a line of questioning, I shall object to it because it's not part of the appellant's case. It may be that it's not, but I've sat through a number of these inquiries recently where this point has been, if you like, the point of departure. And as I say, the appellant's statement of case has got nothing to do with anything being out of date.
Okay.
I hadn't asked any question along those lines to begin with. It is agreed in the Statement of Common Ground that this policy is not an MPPF compliant assessment. That's agreed between the two parties. It's paragraph 2.4. So I don't think it's an unfair point for me to raise when it is actually agreed between the parties.
Well, I do not. Why, sir? We're talking later on in closing about whether the most important policies for the purposes of determining this application are out of date. And there are two ways of getting at that. The first is to ask, do we have a 5-year housing land supply? That's plainly an issue. The second is to ask, are those policies out of date by dint of that part of the framework which will render a policy out of date for other reasons. Now, that is why I made the point just now. If the appellant had intended that to be a line of argument, they were obliged to say so in their statement of case, and they didn't. And you'll also have read Mr. Wakefield's proof, and you'll have noticed there's no attempt made in Mr. Wakefield's proof to invoke, if you like, the second limb of paragraph 11D. And I do object in the strongest terms to my learned friend going down this line. It was not part of their case, and if he does so, he does it at his own peril. I want to make that very clear. There is a legitimate argument we had about 5-year supply, and that's on the table. But to go behind policy CS13 and say, well, is this policy based upon an out-of-date requirement? Should we have reviewed the plan by now? So on and so forth. That takes a different tack, and it isn't part of the appellant's case. So he can ask these questions, but it's inappropriate that he should do so. And you'll have recalled, sir, that last week I was required to give way on 1 or 2 points. Well, I'm making my position very clear, I hope.
Right. Are you going to carry on against that background?
Yes, sir.
Fine. I shall be asking his witness to identify parts in the statement of case where these points are raised. And there will be consequences if you can't do so.
I asked the witness what the text of the policy is. I don't know why that's objectionable, just to ask the witness to read the policy, and then it's being suggested, well, this line of inquiry. I haven't even started a line of inquiry, so I'm not even sure what is being objected to. So I sincerely, I don't.
Probably best if you proceed, and if I feel it is going away from the subject matter at hand, I'll intervene. But I think better to just proceed. It's a fair point. He hasn't actually asked any questions other than to turn up the policy.
I didn't want to let him go too far down the line, so before I'd made my point, but I'll stop now and let it go.
Okay.
Well, I'm sure I'll be told off, sir, if I do breach the line. Okay, let's go back to the policy.
Yep.
So it says that the appropriate level of new homes will be reviewed by 2018.
Yes.
Just in terms of the timeline, the core strategy was adopted in 2012.
Yes.
This policy, it was then...
The original version of this policy, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Then subsequent to the legal challenge, this policy was actually adopted in the form we look at it right now in 2015.
Yes.
But at that time, a number of the other policies were still needing to be remitted for redetermination.
Yes, so they'd been remitted and they were to be re-examined. The inspector determined to do it in two parts, so to fix this policy, and this policy CS13, as we've just read it, was re-adopted in September 2015 upon direction by the Secretary of State, and then we moved on to look at the other remitted policies.
Thank you. We then had, and the relevant policies that we're talking about that were remitted, and I'll put them to you so the inspector's got a note, but this is from the council's website. It's CS6, CS14, CS19, 28, 30, 31, 32, and 33.
Yep, so from memory, they were the Greenbelt policy, the distribution of housing, the strategic gaps, and as I referred to earlier, the area policies. So for each tier in the settlement hierarchy, what was permitted and what was not. So anything that might require a consequential change if the housing requirement differed from that originally adopted.
Thank you. And the reason why they were remitted, if I understand it correctly, is because they are all intrinsically linked to CS13.
It was that they may, I think the direction stated that they may require consequential change. So yes, from that, if the housing requirement was to increase substantially, those policies may require change.
Yeah, and it's because it's an obvious point. If your housing requirement policy has got a problem, well, the policies that sought to implement that, distribution policies equally
could require consequential change.
Yeah,
yes.
And that's still the case today, isn't it? If there's something wrong with this housing requirement policy, there's a consequent impact on those other policies in the plan.
There could be, although as adopted, the area policies now provide significant flexibility, and that was as part of that sequence of events. We've got as far as this policy being readopted. The area policies were then subject to modifications before they were readopted, and they introduced a level of flexibility.
Thank you. If you turn up the housing statement of common ground, if you would, please.
Yes. Yes, I have that.
And we're going to page 3, and it's paragraph 2.4.
Yeah.
And you can see that it said it's agreed that the minimum housing requirement over the period contained within policy CS13 was subject to a separate examination.
Yep.
And we agreed it was concluded by the examining inspector that this housing requirement was not based on an NPPF compliant assessment and that it may be lower than it should be, but it was found sound subject to an early review.
Yes.
And just to bottom that out, if we go to core document A4, if you would please. It's
The
possible...
inspector's report on CS13?
Yeah, it's possible there's two A4s, but it's the final report that you want to go to from Inspector Punchin.
Yes, Inspector Punchin's, yeah, I've got that.
Thank you. And internally, we're going to go to page 11, please.
Yep.
And it's paragraph 35, and you can see that the inspector said, in these circumstances, it's difficult to come to any other conclusion than that policy CS13 has been prepared outside of any clear strategic context which would satisfy the requirements of the framework. This would be a serious failing for any plan, but even more so where there is a long recognised interrelationship between the housing market of the plan area and that of an adjacent major city, in this case Bristol.
Yes, that is what that paragraph said. I mean, the preceding paragraphs do refer to how this was a highly unusual situation. It also says in this report, I think it's paragraph 42, that it wouldn't be appropriate to adopt a housing requirement that was unsound. Yes, paragraph 42, page 12 of that report. The final sentence on the page, I do not consider that it would be appropriate, even for a short period, to recommend the adoption of a policy which is essentially unsound.
So is there someone speaking? I'm hearing muttering. I don't know if that's just me, but it's quite off-putting wherever it's coming from.
I can't hear.
It says, am I going mad? Am I alone?
That was a vague noise.
Okay. Right. Do you hear it as well?
I did hear him muttering. You're not going.
I'm glad to hear that.
Okay.
In that same document, sorry, if you would, can we go to paragraph 40, please?
Yeah, bear with me.
You got that?
Scrolling back. Yes, I have that.
Thank you. And that's talking about this is the main modification 6 version of the text supporting policy CS13. Can you see where I'm reading from?
Yes.
And it says that when the adopted policy establishes a new housing requirement for the district in early 2017, the council will treat the housing requirement of policy CS13 as having been replaced by the up-to-date development plan policy.
Yep.
And then you can see at the end of that paragraph, the inspector says that this version of the policy should be seen only as a stepping stone towards development of a plan which is MPPF compliant. To rely on any interim version of policy CS13 beyond 2018 runs the risk that housing delivery could diverge unacceptably from a properly assessed requirement and provision trajectory.
Yes, that's what that says.
Yeah. So it's right that when this policy was adopted, it was adopted in the context that there was uncertainty, and it was thought, well, this policy will do for a short time, but it shouldn't be used after 2018. By that point, you should have had a replacement.
That was everybody's intention, that emerging joint spatial plan would have occurred by that point. As I mentioned, paragraph 42 does acknowledge that it had to be found sound to be adopted, but yes, the intention was that a new housing requirement would be in place or would be known by 2017, and the intention at the time was for it to be adopted by 2018.
Yeah, and it was thought that this policy CS13 was likely to be lower than the actual requirement.
Yes, it was thought it would likely be lower. Nobody knew what the new number would be at the time it was drafted, but yes.
Yeah. And just so we know what actually happened with the review, as I understood it, the council with other authorities did pursue the review,
yes,
but it failed at the duty to cooperate stage.
It was at its examination phase. It was submitted for examination. The examination opened, and partway through the hearings, it was paused, and the councils then subsequently withdrew from that plan.
Yeah, and there hasn't been any subsequent review or otherwise.
So the new local plan, the emerging local plan, sorry, that we talked about earlier, will be the council. So the council aren't proceeding with a joint plan with any of the other authorities anymore. In terms of knowing the number for the 5-year supply purposes were agreed on what the standard method local housing need number is as at today. And that's what the emerging local plan is planning for. The preferred options is the slightly lower number because it was calculated last year before the affordability ratios changed. But that is the direction of travel.
Thank you. So you would agree, therefore, that this housing requirement in policy CS13, not only is it not consistent with the framework, in as much as it's not an MPPF compliant requirement, it wasn't ever intended to operate and be used post 2018.
That wasn't the intention of it, no. It was badged as a minimum, and as I've mentioned, the area policies did include some flexibility to be able to achieve over and above that requirement. But yes, it was intended to have been replaced by now.
Can I ask you to turn up core document G46, please?
The Moore Road appeal decision?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah. Yes, I have that.
We're going to paragraph 68 of that appeal decision, please.
Yes.
Inspector Smith says, dealing with these in turn, it is common ground, as just noted, that the adopted CS does not include a framework compliant assessment of local housing need. To my mind, this means that policy CS13 is clearly out of date, as is policy CS14.
This is the point at which, sir, I do object, and I hope you will know why. If you like, I can take you to my learned friend statement of case. Pursuing issues about policies being out of date is not part of the appellant's case, full stop. It is a separate limb of paragraph 11D, and sir, I object to this being pursued at this point. And I don't think, sir, that is an unreasonable submission. If the appellants had intended to change their case, they could have given notice, and we could have dealt with it on that footing, but they didn't.
What is the point that you're trying to get to in relation to five-year supply? And could you get there without delving into the issues that I've read the statements, and I think it's a fair point that you don't necessarily argue that policy is out of date.
Our case, sir, is that for the purpose of getting into paragraph 11D, getting into the tilted balance, my learned friend's right, there's different ways into it, but where there's no 5-year supply, provided there's no policy that provide a clear reason, you automatically get into the benefit of the tilted balance, which means you don't have to engage with the separate exercise of what are the most important policies.
Yeah.
In this instance, it's common ground that the council identify 5-year supply, so we haven't ever sought to go into that secondary question of what are the most important policies because it's a redundant exercise. This simple point is, well, what's the background to that policy, and that will inform the weight to be attached to that policy. It's a weight question, and we do deal with the weight to be afforded to these policies. It being out of date as a discrete policy in itself, academic for our purposes, because it is out of date because the council identified 5-year supply. I hope that's clear, sir. So this simply goes to the weight to be attached to policy CS13.
Well, if the points remain along those lines and don't stray into whether or not it's out of date, it's you that say that it's academic that it's out of date. I don't personally. Well, I'm not making any points myself, but you know, to focus on what's in the evidence in the case that's being put is what I'm asking you.
Yeah, just on that, so when I say it's academic, what I mean by that is there could be a scenario where the council do have a 5-year housing land supply and it's still thought that their plan's out of date. That's not
the scenario that's before us here, though, is it?
Exactly, sir. And that's
again, and, you know, we're here to talk about 5-year land supply in this particular session, and at no point has the council ever said today, or I think it's clear in the evidence, it's common ground that they haven't got a 5-year land supply.
Okay, so I'll move on in that case,
Yeah.
if it's not going to help you. The next question then, in that case, I need to ask you about is the local housing need, which we know now to be a figure of 1,392 dwellings per annum.
Yes, that's agreed.
And that is a figure which is 33% greater than the housing requirement set out in the development plan.
Than the adopted annual requirement, yes.
Yeah. So that would support this view that the housing requirement in policy CS13 is too low.
It's now known, if you look at it in that way, yes. The standard method didn't exist at the time of its derivation, so couldn't have been known, as we discussed. It was likely to increase, and it has.
So I wonder, can I have 5 minutes?
Of course.
Because I do need to take instructions on this point, whether there's a line of inquiry I don't pursue.
Okay, yeah. So how long do you need?
If I say 10 minutes, just to be absolutely sure, sir.
Okay, so we'll adjourn until 1:45.
Thank you, sir. I am,
ready
thank
to
you, sir.
proceed? I trust that you didn't discuss the case with anyone.
I
and
didn't.
kept
I've been on my own.
Suitably separated. Thank you.
Thank you for that time, sir. So just so it's clear on this particular point, it's no part of our case to get into the most important policies, and I said because it's an academic point, because it's common ground between the parties that the policies are out of date by virtue of the council not having a 5-year housing land supply. The appellant explores the weight to be afforded to those policies. There are contextual points. I'm not going to ask this witness about weight. I'm just exploring the background to the policies because it struck me this was the right witness for that because she's the planning policy officer. I don't mind who I ask the questions of, whether it's this witness or the council's planning witness. These are matter-of-fact points, and I'm just saying this is the background to the policy. This felt like the right witness. The weight, the consequence of that in terms of weight, I'll pick up with the council's planning witness. I hope that's clear.
Yeah.
And I should say thank you, sir, for that time. Well, I'm going to move on then, Mrs. Richards, and we're going to talk about record of delivery of housing, if that's okay?
Yep.
So I want to ask you about Mr. Tiley's proof of evidence, if you would, please. And we're going to go to page 23.
Yes, I have that.
So what Mr. Tiley has done is looked at the completions of each, against each year, and that's against the minimum housing requirement in policy CS13, the 1049.
Yes.
And he's collated those completions to draw up a total under delivery of 3,466 homes. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, if the housing requirement, we discussed earlier when it was adopted, when it was reviewed, etc. But yes, retrospectively, looking back against the 1,049 per year, that is the position, that's agreed.
We've already agreed that the 1,049 was a figure that was too low. And this shows that there's still under delivery against that figure. Would you agree that represents a very substantial under delivery against this minimum housing requirement?
In the context that the new measure is the housing delivery test and the significant under delivery point that we've already explored, yes, these completion figures, if you retrospectively apply the completions against 1,049 a year, there has been a substantial amount of under delivery.
Thank you. It's right, isn't it, that in circumstances such as this, where there is an under delivery of housing, that is necessarily going to constrain the opportunities for economic growth?
Potentially, yes.
And that's potentially evidenced through affordability ratios. And to show that point, if you can turn up paragraph 3.11, please, Mr. Tiley's proof on page 12.
Yes, I have that.
Yeah, and it tells us that the affordability ratio in North Somerset has increased by 51% in the last decade, meaning that housing is now substantially less affordable for households than it was a decade ago. This proportionate increase is the 56th greatest of the 308 local authorities nationally, for which such information is available, and the second greatest in the southwest. Starling, do you disagree?
I don't. Those figures are correct.
Thank you. So it would be fair, wouldn't it, that a likely reason why affordability ratios have worsened in the last decade is because the local planning authority haven't been delivering sufficient housing?
That will be a factor, yes.
Yeah. Affordable housing, we can see, I'm going to invite you to go to core document J7, please. And we're going to go to page 65, if you would, please.
That's the 2009 housing market assessment.
Yes, please.
And I've got table 4.7, is that right?
It should be on page 65.
Oh, I'm in the PDF, bear with me.
It's
All right, it's a
page
couple of pages
68 on
on,
the digital bundle, but it's page 65, and it should be table 4.11, you see at the top of the page?
Yes, I've got that now, sorry.
Thank you. And we see what the annual total housing requirements of households and need. This is in terms of affordable housing need.
Yes.
Yeah. And we can see that North Somerset is listed there, and that there's a total annual net need of 904 dwellings per annum.
Yes, there is in that table, yes.
Thank you. Which would mean that for the total need for the period then of 2009 to 2020 would give 9,944. That's 904 times 11. I'm not asking you to confirm that, but you can assume I've done that right.
I will trust you. Yes, those figures are correct. In the context, and just qualifying that, this document was produced, well, it's dated 2009, jointly by the 4 West of England authorities and other adjoining authorities. They're all, in fact, listed in that table. Subsequent to that, the core strategy policy on affordable housing was adopted with its own housing target.
A housing target for affordable housing isn't the same as a housing need, is there?
No.
Yeah. So that is the housing need in terms of best evidence of what we've got of affordable
That is
housing
an
need.
evidence-based document from 2009, yes.
Thank you. And if we go back into Mr. Tiley's proof, please.
Yep.
And we're going to go to page 84, please.
Yes, I have that.
Thank you. And you can see, in terms of what Mr. Tyler's done, is looked at the delivery of affordable housing, and you can see that in the table, do you see under the category of cumulative shortfall?
Yes.
And you can see that the cumulative shortfall is 8,672.
It is, again, if I could qualify that, against that 2009 evidence-based document. In terms of the adopted core strategy figure of 150 dwellings per annum, to achieve that, the core strategy seeks 30% from market housing, and 87% of that target has been delivered. But yes, I do agree those figures.
Yeah, just so we're clear, your affordable housing requirement policy isn't a reflection of need. It's a reflection of what you think is achievable and viable and what not.
Yes, and that policy wasn't remitted. That policy stayed the same.
Yeah. But in terms of the need, of the SHMAR figure that we looked at.
In terms of the SHMAR figure, yes, I agree that those are the correct proportions.
And the inspector can take that SHMAR figure as actually the best evidence we've got of what the actual need is, not the requirement, but the need is for affordable housing.
The SHMAR figure is outdated. That document, as we've said, was from 2009, so it doesn't directly relate to the proportions of housing required now. But no, that is an extant evidence-based document. I don't seek to dispute it.
Okay, thank you. And just as against the requirement of 150 dwellings, affordable homes set out in policy CS 16, can we turn up table 16? Actually, if we look against that figure, there's been a cumulative shortfall of 265 dwellings.
Yes, that's right. And that's where I get this. It's 87% of the target. So the 1,835, the target would have been 2,110 against the adopted plan figure, and that's the shortfall of 265, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to be a pedantic lawyer. That's not the target, that's the requirement. They are distinct, ultimately. The target would be that anyone who needs an affordable home would have one. That should presumably be the target.
Yes, as a concept, yes.
Yeah. Let's talk about the plan period supply. So if we can turn up core document J1, please.
The residential land survey statement.
Yes, thank you very much. And if we go into the fourth page, if you would, please.
The plan period capacity of identified sites.
Yes, thank you.
Yep.
And It's the fourth page of that document, second to last of core document J1. And can you see the paragraph at the end of that page?
Yep.
And it says, therefore, the total plan period supply is currently 11,370 dwellings. When added to the 12,273 dwellings completed during the first 15 years of the plan period.
Yep.
So that figure, that 12,273 dwellings, that's what the council have completed over the plan period, yes?
Yes.
The council, in the Scott schedule that we've got here, is suggesting that the council are going to deliver an additional 7,199 homes over the remainder of the plan period.
Yes, that's the deliverable supply. So the distinction between that and this table, this is plan period capacity of all of the sites that are remaining. And then for the 5-year supply purposes, that assessment looks at those for which there is clear evidence of deliverability.
Yeah, I understand that. So what we've got up till now, in terms of the plan period, you've delivered 12,273.
That's correct.
And you say, I know it's disputed, but you say, and you're going to deliver 7,199 over the remainder of the 5-year period.
Yep.
If we add those two figures together, that gets us to a total supply of 19,472.
Yes, it would.
Yeah. And we know that the actual requirement over the plan period, that same period that we're looking at, was actually 20,985.
Yep.
So even assuming everything you said in this document is correct,
Yep.
it still means that there'll be a plan period shortfall of 1,513 homes.
It would do, yes. The new plan is intended to be adopted in the intervening period, but yes.
Okay. How does that make any difference to this, what we've just discussed there? That new local plan will contribute towards future 5-year supplies.
It will, from the point of adoption. I don't think I'm disagreeing with you. Yes, if over the next 5 years those 7,199 dwellings were completed, then yes, the figure would be 19,000 and X.
Yeah. Which means that the minimum housing requirement set out in policy CS13, come what may, that will not be met.
Unless delivery was to exceed my forecasts, then no.
Yeah. Let's look up the MPPF, please.
Yep.
And we're going to go to paragraph 11A, if you would, please.
Yes, I have that.
And it says that for plan making, this means that all plans should promote a sustainable pattern of development that seeks to, and then the first one is meet the development needs of their area.
Yep.
We can agree that the development plan will not have met the development needs of the area, in as much as that there will be a plan period shortfall.
I agree that there is likely to be a development plan period shortfall on the figures that we just went through. As I said, those figures in document J1 set out the sites that the plan did identify. The development plan did identify sufficient sites on paper to achieve the housing requirement.
Well, no, because the housing requirement was to be met by 2026.
Yes.
We've just agreed that by 2026, you won't have met that minimum
There are
housing
sufficient allocations and sites identified. Now, if they don't come forward by 2026, no. That links back to my point that the new plan will overlap with this one. And the new plan period will have its own requirements and its own package of sites to deliver.
Sorry, it's not difficult. The plan intention was that you will deliver 20,000 and with some change homes by 2026.
Yes.
That's what the plan intended to do, because that was thought that's the minimum of what we need to have achieved by
That was
2026.
the housing requirement that was adopted, yes.
And we agree that that will not have occurred. So the development plan has not met the development needs of the area.
Once it gets to 2026, if we are to look back, then yes, I would agree with you. It's unlikely that that will have been met.
Thank you. Paragraph 15 of the framework, if you would, please.
Yes.
And again, it says that planning systems should be genuinely plan-led. Succinct and up-to-date plans should provide a positive vision for the future of each area a framework for addressing housing needs. And again, just pausing there, we don't have a framework for addressing housing needs because the housing needs of the area won't be met.
They won't be met on the basis of the supply that's identified in my 5-year supply assessment as we stand here today. If additional sites were to be permitted, there's flexibility within the policies to bring forward additional supply. I would disagree that the plan isn't positively prepared.
Okay. I'll pick that with Mr. Tiley. Paragraph 23.
Of the framework?
Yes, please, sorry.
Yes.
It says that broad locations of development should be indicated on a key diagram and land use designations and allocations identified on a policies map.
Yep.
Strategic policies should provide a clear strategy for bringing sufficient land forward and at a sufficient rate to address objectively assessed needs over the plan period in line with the presumption in favour of sustainable development.
Yep.
This should include planning for and allocating sufficient sites to deliver the strategic priorities of the area. Pausing there, we can agree that if the council do have a plan period shortfall, which we agree is the case, then the council do not have strategic policies that provide that clear strategy. This paragraph in the framework is not complied with.
I disagree in that the area-based policies that we've referred to, so CS28, of the core strategy, CS28, CS31, 32, 33, provide mechanisms and flexibility to deliver additional housing outside of the plan-making remit, so for speculative sites that comply with various criteria and thresholds can be brought forward.
Okay, but in terms of a strategy, if the strategy has, you'd agree with this, the strategy's failed, hasn't it? Because the strategy was, we will deliver this many homes as a minimum, and you know that you won't. So as necessarily, the strategy has failed.
On the basis of the 5-year supply figures, I am agreeing that the completions that I'm predicting, as at now, will not achieve that requirement. Where I disagree is that the policies aren't capable of achieving that. If more consents were to be granted on plan compliant sites, then that could increase.
Right, but there aren't that bevy of sites that, I mean, as you agreed earlier, the council rely on greenfield sites outside of settlement boundaries to have an onward supply. Those are the sort of sites that necessarily are going to be contrary to the development plan, aren't they?
There are circumstances where greenfield sites outside of settlement boundaries can comply with the development plan. Policy CS32, for example, permits sites of up to around 25 dwellings, subject to, I think it's about 8 criteria, can comply with the development plan. Larger scale growth is provided for by the other policies. For Weston-super-Mare, for example, that threshold is 75 dwelling sites that comply with criteria can come forward.
Right, so let me just do the quick maths then. You can get sites for 25 units outside of settlement boundaries. The council, on your figures, need to deliver needs to find 1,513 homes over the next 4 years.
Yes, on the figures we ran through earlier, yes.
Realistically, you're not going to get there in bite-sized sites of 25 units, are you?
No, the 25 is an example, that's for service villages. You can have sites of 50 adjacent to the 3 towns of Clevedon, Nailsea and Portishead. You can have sites of up to 75 around Weston-super-Mare. There are provisions in the plan to allow for flexibility. Another alternative would be for the Western Villages delivery to outpace where my position sits today. If other sites that are already allocated and agreed as suitable could be brought forward quicker, there could be a prospect of achieving more than that 7,199 in my evidence.
Okay, well, I'll pick that up with Mr. Tyler then. I want to talk about the length of time that that the shortfall has existed for. So to do that, can we turn up Mr. Tyler's proof of evidence, please? And we're going to go to page 80, if you would.
80?
Yes.
Yes, I have that.
Thank you. And you can see there we've got table 15.3. And what this shows is Mr. Tyler's collated the appeals that have been determined. It goes on to page 81, but the appeals that have been determined and the findings of all the inspectors in regards to 5-year housing land supply.
Yep.
As a starting point, he's not missed any, has he? There's no appeal decisions that are favourable to the council that he hasn't
No,
included.
he hasn't missed anything.
And there's only one appeal decision where the council were found that they did have a positive 5-year land supply, and that's the Mill Farm appeal decision.
Yes, that was a written reps appeal decision back in 2018, around the same time as the site allocations plan inspector's report was received.
And you can see that Mr. Talley provides the commentary on that appeal decision, that in paragraph 5, that appeal decision said, well, he relied on the conclusions of the inspector's report on the examination of the plan, provides an up-to-date and robust evidence that a 5-year supply of deliverable housing land for this area can now be demonstrated. But actually, if we go into that inspector's report, it actually states in paragraph 69, I reach no conclusion as to whether a 5-year supply of housing land has been demonstrated.
Yep,
Do you agree
agreed.
that that's accurately reporting the situation?
Yes.
So the inspector in the Mill Farm appeal just got it wrong.
The inspector, there were two sections of Inspector Burden's report that referred to 5-year supply. The initial one, where she was talking about the plan was capable of achieving a 5-year supply. And those conclusions that, I can't remember the inspector's name, in that Mill Farm decision, took those later conclusions. So yeah, yes, I don't think that's misreported. I think that's fair representation.
Okay. Thank you. The next point I'd like to look at, so say for that appeal decision, we can agree that for the last 8 years, the council have been found to not have a 5-year housing land supply.
Yes.
And that appeal, the Mill Farm, was foreshadowed by one immediately before, the Farley Fields one, and very soon afterwards in Western Business Park. Again, both of them looked at 5-year supply and actually reached the conclusion that there wasn't one.
Yes, the Farley Fields and the Western Business Park had forensic examination of the land supply position. It's headed by me and Mr. Tiley, I think.
Thank you. In terms of going beyond 2026, I'm right in saying that there is no trajectory that gives us any indication as to what the housing will do after 2026?
There's not. Given the point in the plan period that we're at, the immediate next 5 years do align with the remaining 5 years of the plan period. No trajectory has been published beyond that. The emerging local plan, that will be a matter for that. Identifying, as I've said, new allocations and profiling how we expect them to come forward, hence the reference earlier to the mixed portfolio of sites. Some of them will need to be short-term supply to follow on immediately from the package of sites that we have at the moment. But no, there is not a published trajectory beyond that.
Thank you. Can you turn up the framework again? And we're going to get to paragraph 68, please.
Yeah. Yes.
And you can see in paragraph 68, second sentence, from this, planning policy should identify a sufficient supply and mix of sites, taking into account their availability, suitability, and likely economic viability. Planning policies should identify a supply of specific deliverable sites for years 1 to 5 of the plan period, and specific developable sites or broad locations for growth for years 6 to 10, and where possible for years 11 to 15 of the plan.
Yep.
As we sit here today, because the plan period ends in 2026, we've got no ideas of growth for years 6 to 10 or 11 to 15, do we?
Again, without reference to the emerging local plan, that indicates the direction of travel, sets the new spatial strategy, and the draft. The preferred options document that was published for consultation does include a package of sites that will comprise the next plan period supply, but no, there is not an annualised trajectory beyond the 5 years.
Thank you. The next point I'd like to is look at the housing delivery test results. So to do that, we're going to go to table 8 in Mr. Tiley's proof, please.
Yes, which page, sorry?
Oh, sorry, it's actually in your proof.
My
sorry.
evidence, yep. Yes, I have that.
Now, as I understand what you've done here is that you've sought to backtrack and retrospectively apply housing delivery test results to previous years, during which time the housing delivery test was not in existence.
Yes, to be fair, I think the preceding page, paragraph 96, does explain what I've done. I acknowledge that it's only been an official measure for the past 4 years, but I've replicated the results for previous years.
In terms of it trying to do that, we don't know, do we, what the housing delivery test figure would have been for those previous years?
What I've set out there is the requirement for the, so if we go back to table 8, the row which is requirement for period is the 3147 over each 3-year period previously. That is the 1049 from the core strategy for each of those 3 years. And I've just replicated using the same methodology that exists today back over time.
Right, okay. What Mr. Tiley has done, actually, so you've measured this against the housing requirement that was adopted in 2015, though, haven't you?
Yes.
So again, in terms of how robust this is as an exercise, you've relied on a housing requirement that didn't exist and judged it against a housing delivery test that didn't exist.
But the completions figures that we just looked at, they are retrospectively applied back to the start of the plan period, 2006. So all of those completions figures we ran through and judged against 1,049 per year, that would be incorrect.
Just your footnote there that you have there at the top of page 25.
Yep.
You note that this is the requirement adjusted for all local authorities for an 11-month period, 2019 to 2020, and an 8-month period, 2020 to 21, to take account of the pandemic.
Yes, so that's how the official government results were published.
Yeah. During the pandemic, there was a grace effectively given to local planning authorities for an acknowledgement that there might be a short-term frustration to their delivery owing to the pandemic.
Yeah, it was unprecedented circumstances. The construction industry effectively down tools and were off-site for not insignificant amounts of time, and that's reflected by the government in their statistics.
If you go to Mr. Tiley's rebuttal, please.
Yes, I have that.
And we're going to the top of page 7, please.
Yes.
So you can see Mr. Tiley's looked at the housing delivery test and he's made an adjustment that if you were to remove that grace period for the pandemic, they're the figures that you arrive at. Do you disagree with his figures?
I don't disagree with them. I disagree with the principle of removing the grace period. But no, those figures are mathematically correct.
Thank you. You would agree that the number of homes that are delivered will be influenced by the number of homes committed, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Yeah, and to that end, in terms of the capacity of available sites that you've got right now, if you turn up Mr. Tiley's, sorry, actually, no, it's your proof, so sorry, it's table 9 of your proof, please.
Yeah, bear with me.
Page 27.
Yes.
Thank you. And in terms of the capacity, in 2017, there was actually more available capacity in terms of large sites than there is now. Well, in the total capacity overall, because you can see that in 2017, the total capacity was 12,003.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's less, so it's 11,018.
Yes. What that doesn't take account of, and there's no row in this table 4, is the completions for the same period.
We know what those completions are. What difference would that make, sorry?
So the completions, overall, there's been, in the 5-year period, 4,278 completions.
Okay.
So the capacity is only reduced, hasn't it, by 985 over the period. If you took account of those 4,278 completions, the capacity now from 5 years ago is actually 3,293 more on the basis of the delivery in that period.
Sorry, I'm a little bit lost by that. The capacity's down. How does that help you?
The capacity is down as we progress through the plan period because those sites are being delivered. If a site of 50, which was in the capacity at 2017, has since completed, that's 50 units complete, and they won't show in the 2021 column as capacity anymore.
Okay, well, I'll pick that point up with Mr. Tiley. The next point I want to talk about is the realism of the trajectories and how successfully the council have been in predicting what onward supply will be. And to do that, we're going to turn up Mr. Tiley's proof, and we're going to get to page 40.
Page 40.
Yes, please.
Yep.
Table 9.1.
Yes.
What we see here is a suite of appeal decisions, Sandford, Old Mixon, Backwell and Western Business Park.
Yep.
In those appeals, the council supply was forensically dissected.
Yes.
Would I be right in saying you were the witness?
I was, yep.
And you would have been saying to an inspector, so for Sandford, you'd be saying, well, the deliverable supply is 1,765.
Yep.
The inspector who determined that appeals dropped it down, said it's actually 1,437.
Yep.
But actually what we know is the actual completions were 856.
They were. So again, part of this time frame that we're looking back over the past 5 years is 2 years worth of COVID situation, unprecedented circumstances. As in my evidence, I do accept that those figures are correct before we carry on. But as I've shown in my evidence, the very final table, a significant proportion of the supply at that time was housing allocations from the development plan, which was still emerging in part at that time. Since then, the plan has been adopted, and a number of those sites now have detailed consent, and indeed the amount of full and outline permissions are substantially higher, and the stock of units under construction is significantly higher.
So that answer doesn't work for me, because if we look at the figure 9.2 in the same page,
yes,
you can see what Mr. Tiley's done is he's set out what position the council took in respect to those appeals.
Yep.
Now, the pandemic, let's say that you were accurate for the first 3 years, and then the pandemic took a hit, and we saw the figures come off. You might think, well, there's some credibility in what you've said. But you were wrong every single year there, weren't you?
I don't dispute any of those figures, nor that figure.
Yeah, so in the Sandford appeal, your evidence to the inquiry in the council's position was 206% off what actually happened. And that's not because of the pandemic. You were just wrong.
No, not at that point. It wasn't because of the pandemic, no.
Yeah. And there's a history of this council telling inspectors that we'll do a lot better than actually we know has happened, isn't there?
Yes, that is reflected in those figures. As I've said, a number of those sites at that time were just allocated. They now, significantly more proportion, have full and outline consent and are literally being built as we speak. So the position has improved. But again, I don't dispute those figures as presented.
And the council at this appeal, in terms of what the council say is going to be delivered over the next 5 years,
Yep.
It's 7,199, which breaks down as an average of 1,440 dwellings per annum.
That is the average. It's not profiled exactly in that way, but yes.
Yeah, but on average, your council say that we will deliver roughly 1,440 dwellings every year for the next 5 years,
Yep.
in the context that for the last 5 years, the most you got was 856.
Yes.
Yeah, so you are suggesting a huge step change in your delivery, aren't you, for the next 5 years, to even get to where you're predicting here?
Yes, we are. The government is requiring a significant step change, and by consenting additional sites, and as I said, those sites, there are more units under construction now than ever before. Yes, that is the figure.
Yeah. So you say you're going to, it's almost double what you've done previously over the next 5 years is what you say is going to happen in the context that, as we saw a moment ago, the actual capacity is decreasing in these large sites.
As I said, I dispute that the capacity is decreasing. The amount of sites that are left to be built out from that plan period is going down, but that doesn't take account of the completions for the period. Over the past 3 years, 2018-19, 19-20 and 2021, despite the COVID effects that I've mentioned, those figures have increased year on year. And yes, that is my position.
Thank you. Let's talk about non-implementation rates. In terms of the current MPPF, it's consistent with the 2012 version of the MPPF, which required that there needed to be a realistic prospect of delivery.
Yes.
Yeah. And as a matter of logic, not all planning permissions will be implemented, will they?
No. Are we talking specifically about small sites here?
No.
Okay.
But as you're talking about small sites, they are more likely to not be implemented because you've got a lot of people who won't be developers who might just be trying to put in speculative applications on their land.
Yes, in theory, I'd accept that as a principle.
Yeah. The council, for the purpose of this appeal, they assume 100% delivery on small sites, don't they?
Yes, against the backdrop that that capacity figure also closely aligns to the past completion rates.
Right. The council used to apply a non-implementation lapse rate under the PPF 2012, didn't they?
We have done previously, yes.
Yeah, and to show that, let's turn up core document A5, please.
The inspector's report on the other remitted policies.
Thank you so much. And it's page 8. Paragraph 19, please.
Yep.
And there the inspector noted that there's also uncertainty over planning permission lapse rates. The council has applied a lapse rate of 9% to small site permissions, which reflects the average lapse rate for the 3 years up to 2011, a figure derived from research for the 2011 Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment.
Yep.
And then going forward, the inspector, at the end of that last sentence of that paragraph, the inspector noted there is the possibility that a higher lapse rate than allowed by the council could occur in the next few years, with a negative effect on the housing supply if adequate flexibility is not built into the policies.
Yep.
So at this stage, the council were putting in a 9% lapse rate. Inspector said yes, but it might need to be higher.
It might need to be higher if there was not adequate flexibility in the policies. That flexibility is what I've referred to a couple of times. Smaller sites are permitted around villages, and they have come forward. That's why my answer about the backdrop of now these small site completions are actually at a very similar rate to the stock of small site permissions that we have.
Just pause there. And just want to look at how other inspectors have dealt with this non-implementation rate in this local authority. So to that end, can we go to core document A7, please?
Yep.
Sorry, through you, we're going to do a collective reading exercise. So we're going to go to paragraph 54.
Yes.
On page 12, please.
Yeah, I've got that.
And there the inspector, for the examination inspector, said, in relation to the lapse rate in planning permissions for small consented sites, the council maintains its position that a rate of 10% is appropriate, but I repeat my view following the hearings that this appears optimistic for North Somerset. Other sources of supply expected to contribute towards the core strategy requirement include windfall sites, change of use from rural buildings and empty homes. Yep. So 10%, and again, that was considered optimistic. And then I want to see how inspectors' decisions have looked at this. So we're going to go to core document G7, please.
The Farley Fields decision, yes.
Yes, thank you. Secretary of State decision. And we're going to go to paragraph 17, please, page 3.
Yes.
And there, the Secretary of State has given careful consideration to the inspector's analysis of housing delivery. With regard to small consented sites, the Secretary of State agrees that it is reasonable to apply a lapse rate of 10%.
Yep.
And you can see that that was endorsing the findings of the inspector. So for the sake of completeness, let's turn them up, which is page 70, please.
Yes, paragraph 323, I think.
Yes, that's right, thank you. Regarding small consented sites, both parties consider it appropriate to apply a lapse rate to this source, but they do not agree over the rate. The Council's application of a 9% lapse rate for small sites is based on past trends. However, the appellant's housing witness identifies in his evidence that approach appears to be mathematically flawed. And the following paragraph,
Yep.
the inspector said, well, in the absence of a reliable figure, and given the lapse rate should be applied to small sites, I consider it reasonable to employ a flat rate of 10% as a proxy, as is often done by my colleague inspectors in such circumstances.
Yep.
And you'd agree, 10% is not uncommon, isn't it, for a lapse rate?
It's not. It's a fairly standard figure to use, yes.
Yeah, it's fairly standard, but obviously in this local authority you're saying that your lapse rate figure is 0%.
We are not applying a lapse rate figure, and as I've set out, we're justifying that on the basis that the stock of planning permissions for small sites is lower than our windfall rate, if you like. So I'm not seeking to double count the two. How we've done it is small sites with consent over the first 3 years and a windfall rate, which is of similar order, in fact, which is agreed between us for years 4 and 5.
So you're going to have to explain that to me again. It's just me being slow, but I'm not sure I followed.
That's fine. Okay, so the stock of planning permissions from small sites amounts to 541 dwellings. And I've profiled that at a rate of 180, 180 and 181. I believe Mr. Tiley agrees with the principle of profiling it over a 3-year period. He's just applied a lapse rate and then done the same thing. It's my position that this non-implementation rate, A, isn't required by the MPPF. It doesn't specifically state that there should be one. And that 180 per annum is of the same order as the average small site completions over the last 5 years. And therefore, I think it's a justified figure.
Okay. The next appeal I'd like to... I'm going to pick that up with Mr. Tyler because that comes down to matters of professional judgment ultimately. But just if I invite you to look at G41, please. Core document G41.
Yeah, that was me. Yes, I've got that.
Yeah, and paragraph 13, the inspector says, this is in a different local authority in Sherwell, but it said, in my view, it's not realistic to expect that all dwellings that have the benefit of planning permission will in fact be delivered. I acknowledge the council's opinion that there should not be a lapse rate applied, given that when undertaking reviews of permissions, they liaise directly with developers and agents. The submission of applications to discharge planning conditions can be taken as an indication of intent to implement a permission, and there is a good record delivery. However, this does not account for any circumstance where a development may not come forward. As such, I do not consider it realistic to expect a 100% delivery rate for the permitted dwellings.
Yes, it's not clear from that paragraph, and as you mentioned, it's a different local authority, whether that also relates to large sites and small sites.
Just this point that you, as I understand it, your argument on lapse rates is you're saying, well, we've got a good history of granting permission for small sites and then being implemented.
Yep.
Where do I see that in your evidence? Any correlation between the amount of small sites delivered, granted, and the amount actually delivered?
Both sets of figures are in my evidence, and I haven't put forward a lapse rate in my evidence. You've asked me to comment on the one put forward by Mr. Tiley, which I have. The small site completions over the past 5 years are in my evidence, which is how I've just answered your question.
No, as I understand it, you're saying, well, presumably we've granted this many small sites and they've all been delivered. And that's why we don't need to have lapse rates in this local authority. That's as I understand your point.
No, I'm saying that the average completions figure over the past 5 years is, as a sense check, the two are directly comparable.
So the two what? I mean, if we had a table where you say, well, look, here's all the permissions we've granted, and here's the evidence to show that they've all been implemented, I'd understand. And they've all been completed. I'd understand that. But I don't see that we've got any of that sort of evidence before us. Have I missed that?
So in my proof of evidence, page 19, starting from paragraph 74, the MPPF is clear that sites that do not involve major development, so again, we're only talking about small sites, they're deliverable unless clear evidence exists to demonstrate that they will not come forward. This package of sites is reviewed annually, and it goes on to explain, as I have, I've profiled the stock of consents over the next 3 years, 180, 180, and 181. And I've set out there that given the high proportion already under construction, this is considered robust, and the 3-year period, which we're agreed upon, accords with the standard time period. And then table 76 sets out the last 5 years' worth of completions. That's an average of 199 a year. So the average figure for the last 5 years is higher than that I've profiled on the basis of consents without a lapse rate.
I see, but you don't tell us how many permissions have been granted for these previous years.
No, that's not in there.
But isn't that the piece of information we would need to be able to draw the conclusion? Because you want the inspector...
I would have undertaken that exercise if I was advocating a lapse rate. My evidence sets out that that is how I have put forward those small site permissions.
Yeah, I understand that, but historically this local planning authority has had a lapse rate of 10%, and that's been endorsed by a suite of inspectors, including examination inspectors and Section 78 inspectors.
Yes.
You're now saying, well, we don't need one, because actually we've been granting this many small sites and they've all been delivered.
No, at no point have I said everything that's been consented has been delivered. In fact, I agreed that there will be circumstances where small sites permissions are granted and then do not come forward. You might get multiple permissions. It is likely that not everything with consent will come forward, but we've profiled the 541 units of capacity over the next 3 years. As I've set out, it's illustrative in that that actually would achieve a lower figure. If I was to put forward a windfall rate, that would be of the same order. The windfall rate isn't disputed.
Okay, well, I'll pick that point up with Mr. Tyler. I understand your answer. I want to talk about base dates, please, and talk about, there are some sites that you rely on that are post the base date. We'll get into the specifics in the roundtable session, but I want to just explore matters of principle on that question. So for the base date, for the purpose of the 5-year supply, we're relying on the period of 1st of April 2021 to the 31st of March 2026.
Yes, that's agreed.
And the reason why we have a base date is it responds to a pragmatic issue that on a week-by-week basis, you can't, or you and your colleagues can't go out and understand how many units have been delivered, how many have lapsed and whatnot. It's a big task every year. So that's why we've got a base date, so that we artificially draw a line in the sand and say, right, let's stop and let's figure out what we know at this point. Because you've got to figure out where the conversion's coming from, what's lapsed, what's been demolished, changes of use, what's been granted. And it's a big undertaking, and it's a plus and minuses. Something's been granted, but something might have come out.
Yes.
And as a consequence, if there is a site which was granted planning permission tomorrow, we agree it doesn't go into the supply.
That is correct, yes, I'd agree.
Because we're similarly not having regard for the permission, the site that might have lapsed tomorrow, because that's typically...
To be fair, one of the concessions that I've made during the last inquiry, we have taken out some large sites that have lapsed in the intervening period. The stock of small sites, we haven't done that for. As you say, that's a list of 300 odd sites. It wouldn't be practical to go through those all of the time. There is a site in the housing trajectory, land at the former TJ Hughes, in fact, just around the corner, which had consent. It benefited from consent up until May of last year. I've taken that one out now on the basis that it's not implementable.
Yeah. I suppose when you know that it's lapsed, but the point is you're not aware necessarily of all the schemes that will have lapsed.
Not in terms of the small sites. The large sites, we have, a relatively shorter list and a much better handle on. They're reviewed throughout the year, and I have made concessions where consent lapses on a large site.
Yeah. And so ultimately, the reason why we've got this base date is to fix a point in time where you essentially freeze the five-year supply considerations and you form a view as to what was deliverable then.
Yep.
Yeah. And of course, if we were to do anything other than that and trying to just think, well, something positive's happened on this site subsequent to that base date, you would get an artificial impression of your 5 years of housing land supply because you're not having the other side of the coin of everything that's coming out potentially.
Yes, as a principle, I agree with you. We are going towards there's two sites that this applies to within the schedule. We can either talk about them specifically or, that's a matter for later. The sites that I've included there's two large sites where there was a resolution to grant consent internally in advance of that base date. I'm agreed on both that the decisions weren't issued. I think both went out in May of 2021.
I think in fairness, I shouldn't ask you about those sites because that's a roundtable session. But I want to talk to you about how other inspectors have dealt with unallocated, unpermitted sites. So I want you to turn up, it's core document G39, if you would please.
Yes, the Woolpit decision.
Yes, thank you. This is Inspector Stevens.
Yep.
And what Inspector Stevens says is at paragraph 67 on page 13, please.
Yes, I have that.
You're there quicker than me. The inspector says at 67, in my view, the definition of deliverable in the glossary to the MPPF 2018 does not relate to or include sites that were not the subject of an allocation, but had a resolution to grant within the period assessed within the AMR. The relevant period is the 1st of April 2017 to 31st of March 2018. There is therefore a clear cut-off date within the AMR, which is the 31st of March 2018. The Council's supply of deliverable sites should only include sites that fall within the definition of deliverable at the end of the period of assessment, i.e. 31st of March 2018. Sites that have received planning permission after the cut-off date, but prior to the publication of the AMR, have therefore been erroneously included within the Council supply. The inclusion of sites beyond the cut-off date skews the data by overinflating the supply without a corresponding adjustment of need. Indeed, that is why there is a clear cut-off date set out in the AMR. Moreover, the site west of Barton Road, Thurston, should be removed from the supply as its permission postdates the cut-off for the relevant period of assessment. Obviously, there's findings there that are relevant to that local authority, but as a matter of principle, do you think Inspector Stevens has got it wrong that you have regard to the base date as being a cut-off date and events that happen subsequently to that base date, you leave out of account?
As a matter of principle, I agree that the base date is there for that very reason. Again, I won't refer to specific sites. We can have that discussion this afternoon, save for pointing out that, again, where sites have expired, they have been removed from the supply. So it's not an overinflation exercise. Thank you.
I want to talk to you briefly about the application of flood risk policy. And to do that, if you can turn up paragraph 161 of the framework, please.
Yes, I have that.
Thank you. It says all plans should apply a sequential risk-based approach to location development, taking into account all sources of flood risk and the current and future impacts of climate change, so as to avoid, where possible, flood risk to people and property.
Yep.
So typically, it's in a plan that one will have regard for the sequential exception tests.
Typically, yes.
Yeah. The council, though, in this instance, in respect to the site allocations plan, did not, and we can see that in core document A3, please. We're going to turn to page 32, please.
Sorry, bear with me.
Yeah.
Which page?
32, please.
The schedules.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there are more than 20 pages that we could go through, and I'm not going to do that because I'm conscious of the time. But what we see, this page, and it goes on, but you see the West Acres Caravan Park.
Yes, I do, yeah.
Site-specific details, a flood risk assessment, sequential exception test will need to accompany any planning application.
Yep.
Orchard House, again, flood risk assessment, sequential exception test will
Yep.
need to accompany. Land to the rear of Locking Road.
Yeah, if it helps, I will agree that that is listed as a requirement for a number of sites. I wonder where we're going. I'll take the point now. The Environment Agency were satisfied that this package of sites was suitable and could be adopted with that form of words. In the case in point, some of those that you've already read out to me have already come forward and been delivered since the adoption of this plan. The West Acres Caravan Park is under construction and the former Western Library has already been built. Part of that was the history, and again, those plans overlapping, and to adopt the development plan in a timely fashion, that wording was agreed with the Environment Agency.
Yeah, but the Environment Agency, ultimately, they said, well, you can have these allocations subject to you having to actually go away and do your sequential exception tests.
Yes.
Prior to the grant of planning permission.
Yeah.
And in the absence, so these sites that you need to go away and do the sequential exception test, we don't know what they will say.
I don't have the information in front of me. It was an intention to adopt the plan quickly. There's wording around them being satisfied that they were capable of passing those on the basis of flood mitigations, etc. But no, that's not in front of the inquiry.
Okay, so the inspector can't have regard for that because I've not read that. Okay. So in terms of sites that are...
So sorry, just for my notes, I missed what Mrs. Richards just said, that you said she can't refer to. Could I just ask her to repeat that, please?
It's the point that the Environment Agency were satisfied that those sites were capable of achieving those criteria. The flood risk assessment, the sequential test and the exception test needs to accompany the planning applications, but they were happy for those sites to be allocated.
Okay, well, if we turn up, core document G26 on this same point. Sorry, in G26, page 8, if you would, please.
Yep.
And it's paragraph 45. It's talking about the local plan allocations. These 5 long-standing sites do not as yet benefit from planning permission and have been brought forward from the previous local plan. By definition, they must be considered as developable. The Environment Agency has, in principle, no objection to the development of each of these sites, but is unable to confirm that they are capable of delivery. Given the flood risk issues related to them, sequential exception tests are required, and this is explicitly set out within the relevant Part 1 of Schedule 1 of the recently adopted SAP. This requirement will add time to the delivery of the site and an element of uncertainty that these sites will, in fact, come forward within the 5 years or are capable of delivery. The inspect that the Folly Road inquiry considered that legitimate concerns have been raised in relation to the delivery of individual sites, yet that they considered these were not necessarily insurmountable. However, on the evidence before me, including the detailed site-specific requirements to which I've been referred with the new adopted development plan. Given the uncertainty, I favour the appellant's approach that there be a zero dwelling contribution from this source.
Yep.
So that was an inspector in this local authority who noted that where you've got the Environment Agency who's saying, well, we can't confirm whether they're capable of delivery because they've still got to undergo a sequential and exception test, the inspector thought, well, in those circumstances, they're not deliverable and it's a zero.
For those particular sites that we were talking about, yes. As I've just pointed out, some of them have now actually come forward and completed. But yes, in terms of those sites, that is that inspector's conclusion.
Yeah.
I'm really sorry to, can I just ask, just for my re-examinations,
Of course.
Is it being suggested that the allocation of a batch of sites has been made contrary to national policy because of what was done vis-a-vis the sequential test? Is that the point that's being put?
No. No, we're not making that point at all.
Okay. But you started off with paragraph 161 of the NPPF.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm not saying that there's something deficient with the site allocations plan. It's simply as a matter of fact, the site allocations plan didn't go through sequential and flood risk and exception test, and that still needs to be done in respect to a suite of sites. And as I understood, this witness agreed that that, as a matter of fact, is what happened. I'll turn up the actual core document A7.
I was going to say paragraph 38 on page 10. That's re-examination.
It's core document A7, and we're going to paragraph 52, please.
Yep.
It was said, in addition to the uncertainty concerning the delivery of the strategic site, a number of the other allocated sites are affected by technical issues relating to flood and surface water management. The need for a flood risk assessment and surface water or flood management scheme is identified for some 20 sites in Schedule 1 of the SAP, which are expected to accommodate over 900 dwellings. The Environment Agency has indicated that it has no objection in principle to the development of the sites, although it cannot indicate the scale of works which might be required in mitigation or whether they would be capable of delivery. Whilst the submission of an FRA is a standard practice in a number of instances, the negotiation of an appropriate surface water or flood management scheme for each of these sites could add to the lead in time for the start and development, and the mitigation measures could affect viability, which may also delay implementation. So as far as the Environment Agency is concerned, they cannot confirm that these schemes will be capable of delivery because we don't know the outcome of the sequential and flood risk assessments in respect to these sites. That's fair, isn't it?
At that point in time, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mr. Leader's point, paragraph 38, but I hope it's clear we are not saying that the site allocation plan doesn't conform with national policy. So I think that's what the point from paragraph 38, but I don't think we disagree on that point. Okay, next point, clear evidence. If we look up the MPPF, please.
Yes.
This is the last subject as well, so I'll be finished by lunch. And we'll turn up the definition of deliverable, please.
Yep.
So on page 66 of the framework, it's been considered deliverable. I'm sure you're familiar with it. So
Yep.
Realistic prospect, housing will be delivered on the site within 5 years. We then have a category, what's described as category A,
Yep.
which are sites which aren't major development and have planning permission. And that puts the onus on Mr. Tiley, doesn't it? He's got to provide the clear evidence that those homes will not be delivered within 5 years.
Yes. Yep.
And then there's category B sites, which are sites with outline planning permission for major development, and that reverses that burden. It puts it on you, the local planning authority. You've got to provide that clear evidence.
Yes.
Yeah. And That clear evidence needs to be robust and up to date. You'd agree with that?
I would, yeah.
And how the Secretary of State has dealt with this, we'll turn up a appeal decision, please, and it's going to be core document G24. It's paragraph 21, please.
Of the Secretary of State's letter,
Yes,
yeah.
yes, thank you.
Yes, I have that.
And it said there that the Secretary of State has reviewed the information submitted by the parties, in particular sites where deliverability is in dispute between the appellant and counsel. The Secretary of State agrees with the appellant that some of the sites identified by the counsel at the time the evidence was submitted may not meet the definition of deliverability within the framework. He considers that, on the basis of the evidence before him, the following should be removed from the supply. Sites with outline planning permission, which had no reserved matters applications and no evidence of a written agreement. And a site where there is no application and the written agreement indicates an application submission date of 8 August 2019, which has not been forthcoming with no other evidence of progress. So we can see there that sites with outline planning permission with no reserved matters application and no evidence of a written agreement are not considered deliverable. Do you agree with that?
I agree that that's what that decision says, and that those can be examples of evidence to demonstrate deliverability. The MPPG doesn't include an exhaustive list. From memory, such examples may include written advice from developers, etc. I can go there if you wanted me to, but I would agree that they are examples.
Yeah, well, we're potentially trespassing on the roundtable session, so I don't want to get stuck into that level of detail, because that will be from Mr. Tyler later. Two other appeal decisions I want you to look at on this point, and then we'll be finished. Core document G32, please.
Yeah.
And we're going to paragraph 23 on page 5, please.
Yeah.
Said there, for a number of the disputed sites, the Council's evidence is founded on site-specific statements of common ground which have been agreed with the developer or landowner of the site in question. I appreciate the PPG refers to statements of common ground as an admissible type of evidence, and I've had full regard to that advice, but nevertheless, the evidential value of any particular statement of common ground in this context is dependent on its content. In a number of cases, the statement of common ground produced by the Council primarily record the developer or landowner's stated intentions, without any further detail as to the means by which infrastructure requirements or other likely obstacles are to be overcome, and the timescales involved. This type of statement of common ground does not seem to me to demonstrate that the development prospect is realistic. In addition, most of the site-specific statements of common ground are undated, thus leaving some uncertainty as to whether they represent the most up-to-date position. As a matter of principle, you'd agree that the way the inspectors dealt with that is fair?
I'd say it's fair. I would qualify that with I haven't read the package of evidence that was in front of that inspector, but yes.
Yeah. And the final appeal decision I want to look at is another from Inspector Stevens, and we're going to go to core document G33.
Yep.
And it's paragraphs 56 to 57. Can I just ask you to read them to yourself to save everyone having to listen to my voice ad nauseum?
Yes, I've read that.
Yeah. 2 points. You'd agree, wouldn't you, that clear evidence requires something more, something cogent, something more than simply mere assertions?
Yes.
And similarly, developers are financially incentivized to reduce competition, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
What Inspector Stevens says there about having doubts about a pro forma message from a developer or agent, that's fair, isn't it? To treat those emails with caution. and that they don't constitute clear evidence.
I'd agree that they should be treated with caution, perhaps for both that reason and the opposite. For example, the developers are often promoting their own sites and trying to downplay the supply position for different reasons. But I'd agree with the notion that they should be treated with caution and considered in the round, not just in isolation.
Thank you very much. I've got no further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Timing. It's 5 to 1 now, so it's a question of whether you want to carry on and do your re-examination questions or break for lunch.
What would be your preference? What would you like to do?
I'm quite happy. It depends how long that you think you'll need. And
Well, I won't be too long, sir, because I can obviously put some of the points to Mr. Tiley, can't I? So I'll see if I can keep this reasonably short.
are you happy to carry on?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
fine by me.
Yep.
I'd have thought 10, 15 minutes
Yep.
at the outside.
Yep. Well,
All right, thank you very much, sir. Now, Mrs. Richards, do you recall at the start of your cross-examination, well, towards the start, you were asked to compare housing need with the housing target?
Yep.
Do you happen to know which of those particular elements, the case of Kings Lynn and West Norfolk Borough Council versus Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government and Elm Park Holdings, told us we have to actually meet? If you don't know the answer,
I don't know the answer to
that's fine. I can put it to Mr. Tiley because I know he knows. Good, we'll take that one and put that into the cross-examination box. Next, we were, or rather you were taken to the figures for total requirement under CS13 of 2985 dwellings in total, and it was put to you that 19,472 will get delivered, and I think you were happy to concede that with certain qualifications which we don't need to go into right now.
Yes, with qualifications
There
as
were
of today.
qualifications, and there's just one particular aspect of that question I'd like to explore, which is this. Do you happen to know roughly how many dwellings have come forward in an unplanned way pursuant to policies 28, 30, 32, 33, and I think also 31, on average, since the core strategy was approved in its revised form by Inspector Jonathan Ball?
I haven't put evidence forward giving the figures. I can point to specific examples where sites have come forward and it will have boosted supply, but that's not something that I've sought to quantify in my evidence or put forward.
No, but let me help you in this way. Well, let's see if you can help us, otherwise we'll have to explore the matter a different way. Have there been examples in every year since Inspector Ball recommended the core strategy as amended for approval of sites coming forward under policies CS 28 through to 33?
Yes.
And have any of those sites been substantial sites?
There's an example in Banwell, land at Wolvers Hill Park. That's a site of 54 dwellings that's come forward. There is the Dinghurst Road in Churchill example that I referred to earlier that had come up in Mr. Etchell's evidence. That was a site of 25.
Yeah. All right. I think perhaps I'd better leave that topic to explore with Mr. Tiley. Let's move on. Forgive me, sir, I'm going to try and sieve out matters that I can put to Mr. Tiley. Yeah. Do you recall your questioning about the failure, as I think it's put really, to apply a lapse rate to small sites?
Yeah.
You said, well, we haven't applied a lapse rate to windfall sites. Do you recall that? The windfall application, I'm going to call it now. Help me with this. The windfall provision that you and Mr. Tiley have agreed, is that a provision comprising of planning permissions or completions?
It's based on the past completion rate.
Yeah. So why have you concluded that it is not sensible to apply a lapse rate to the windfall provision and indeed not to the small site provision? I mean, what is the logic of that approach?
So that is what I've done. I have looked at the stock of completions. They have consent as at today. It's 541 units worth of capacity of them. And over a third of them were already under construction. Therefore, I would not consider it necessary, as I explained earlier, to apply a lapse rate to that. And similarly, it provides further reassurance that the figures are robust. They're all of the same ilk. If you split out the committed figures over the next 3 years, and then where it becomes less certain perhaps for the years 4 and 5, that's agreed between us to be based on past completion figures.
And just supposing Mr. Tiley's right, just supposing there might be a lapse rate applied to small sites, can I ask you this question, so what? What is the impact on the 5-year supply if Mr. Tiley's right?
It would be negligible. If we're talking about that stock of 541, I don't believe the stock is actually in dispute. If one were to apply a 10% lapse rate to that, we'd be looking at 50 units.
Yeah. Well, sometimes a so what question is useful, but that is all of my re-examination, thank you, sir. And that completes Mrs. Richards's contribution to the sort of general principles topic. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Richardson.
Thank you.
So yeah, I think on time really. We can adjourn for lunch until 2. Come back and we'll hear Mr. Tiley's evidence on behalf of the appellant. Okay, the inquiry is adjourned.